Welcome to the Mentors Who Made Us. I'm your host, Kate Berezo, and today we're talking with a truly inspiring guest, Greg Bennick. Greg is a speaker, performer, and best-selling author of Reclaim the Moment, 7 Strategies to Build a Better Now. From his beginnings as a performer to co-authoring groundbreaking legislation in Seattle, Greg has built a unique career fueled by creativity, passion, and the power of community. In this episode, we'll uncover the mentors who guided Greg along the way, the pivotal moments that defined his path, and the lessons that turned him into a best-selling author. Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to the Mentors Who Made Us. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Greg Bennick. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. This is a great week. My book just came out. I'm all excited to talk to people about it and excited to talk to you about whatever we talk about, book or otherwise. So it's great being
Book,
here.
mentors, the whole gamut. Because I actually started reading your book this week, or not reading, I'm listening to it. I'm doing the audiobook, and I'm obsessed so far. Again, only through the first chapter, but I'm hooked, and I'm very excited to hear more from you. But of course, I've already texted a couple of friends being like, all right, this is the book you need to buy next.
Nice. Thank you. That's
yes.
wonderful.
No, thank you for taking the time to write it, because I know it's definitely a daunting task, the idea of writing a book, and you went out here and you officially did the thing. And don't correct me if I'm wrong. Are you working on another one?
Yeah, I've been working on a biography on a cultural anthropologist named Ernest Becker, and I've been working on that for about 6 years or so, and
Wow.
that book is going to be done probably within the next year. I hope. We'll see. It's tough to
Great.
say. It's a massive undertaking, a little bit more intellectual and a little bit more checking historical fact based than the book that I did just wrote, which is stories and ideas and anecdotes and things like that. But yeah, there's a couple things in process. But the biography of Ernest Becker is definitely one of them.
Can't wait. And I love your writing style already. And so, speaking of stories, though, I have a couple warm-up questions that will, before we dive into the heavy mentorship-focused stuff, there's a couple things where my curiosity got the best of me, and I was like, listen, I've got Greg here for at least an hour. Can I at least ask him these couple questions? And then of course, we'll make sure to get into the mentorship content, of course. But I just have to know, I met you through my husband, who is also through this hardcore music community. And so going to shows is something that brought us together. And so my first question, and I always love to ask anyone, I'm like, who's the first person to introduce you to hardcore music?
The first person was a guy named John Jones. John Jones, when I was a freshman in high school, wait, hold on. It goes back even before that. Hold on one second. No offense to John Jones if you're listening. John is still out there in the
Shout
world
out to
somewhere,
John.
I know. Chris Gehrig, actually, a friend of mine when I was in about 8th or ninth, maybe 8th grade. Anyway, the point is, my friend Chris had, this is wild, I'm just retracing this now. John was definitely the first person, John and my friend Al, we met. Al went on to sing in a band called The Pissed, punk band. We were in high school together, and those guys definitely were the first people I met who were fully consumed in that music. Like, it was their life. But even
Right.
before that, my friend Chris, at the time, had come over to my house with a cassette tape that he had recorded off the radio of bands he had heard from a college radio station. And I'd never heard anything like it. And we started asking each other, like, where do people find this music? And we started seeking out weird record stores that might have like punk rock records, or that might have just any type of unusual music. I mean, whatever it might be, even like old kind of like folk beatnik type music, just stuff with, some substance to it lyrically. And we found these records, and we just started buying records. And then, of course, after that, we found out where these bands played and started going to shows. I grew up in Connecticut, so I lived about 40 minutes from a club called the Anthrax. And this was an iconic club that most people listening wouldn't have heard of. They would have heard of CBGBs, which is,
Right.
a cultural icon. But the Anthrax for us was major, and we started going to shows, and then the rest is history. But yeah, that's how it all started. I was just a kid.
The rest is history, and I'm curious, are you still in contact with those people, or do they know that they're the ones who put you on to this scene that I think would become,
Yeah,
a lifelong journey for you?
I don't talk to Chris that often. It's very rare that we'll text, but John and I have been meaning to talk like literally as lately as last week,
Wow.
as recently as last week. And Al and I talk all the time. Like, we kind of went divergent paths, meaning Al went the more punk side, I went the more hardcore side, which for listeners, that's a whole podcast in and of itself. What's the difference? What is this? And what are we talking about? But basically, imagine just two types of the same sort of art movement, as it were. And I talk to Al all the time, and his band is playing regularly, and it's pretty fun to see what he's done with his band because it's just gone pretty global. It's pretty exciting.
That is exciting, and I think that's the thing I love about hardcore music. It's just the ways that it brings people together for better or for worse sometimes. But I think like if you hang in there long enough, I think there's a lot of good that can come from it. Again, for
It's
better or
fun.
for worse, it's a fun little scene. I'm curious, how have you always navigated being a quote unquote hardcore kid in these professional landscapes? So are you the person? Are you honest and you're like, this is what it is, or are you more of that like it's like rock music when people
Yeah, well, I
ask
mean,
you?
here's the thing is that's changed over the years, right? So I was doing corporate and doing presentations for groups and different associations and meetings and whatnot as early as 15 years old. So I was doing that well before I was in bands, certainly.
Yeah.
And it was it was very early on. So what's changed over the years is that up until about 15 years ago, I would have to say to my clients, "Yeah, I was in this band," and let them assume that I was playing, Margaritaville covers at
Right.
the local pub or something. But now that all of the punk rock community have grown up, right, and some of those punk rock people have gotten jobs, and some of them are C-level executives.
Yep.
I remember the first time 15 years ago or so when I first mentioned rock music to a group, a C-suite of executives, and they mentioned, and one guy was like, "Wait a minute, what band?" And I mentioned the band. He's like, "I haven't heard of you, but I was a skate kid. I grew up in Southern California." It's like, "Oh, wow, that's cool." And we ended up having a great conversation. I don't bring punk into that world very much,
Yeah.
explicitly. It's not like I go out of my way to mention it. But when it comes up, there's definitely a lot more acceptance and people saying, "Oh, that's cool." In part because punk has become mainstream and we are in a different phase of the art movement, as it were.
Right.
But I definitely think that times have changed in a way and people are more aware of it now, whereas, a couple decades ago, they certainly were not. It was just weird for folks.
Right.
But I haven't been actively involved in the music community in probably 4 or 5 years at this point. I just,
Fair.
it's not something that I've been focused on since COVID started. I was just like, wow, okay, it's time to do some different things for a while. But
Yeah. Like
it's
we're
interesting.
inside for a bit. Yeah.
Well, it's
No, that makes
interesting. I mean, I
sense.
think too that with COVID and the world changing and the pandemic changing, you start thinking to yourself, okay, where's my priority right now? What am I doing? And you mentioned the term like hardcore kid, right? Well, as I as I was hitting my late 40s as the pandemic started, I'm thinking, do I really want to be known as a hardcore kid? That sounds diminutive and strange. I've been a coin researcher and coin collector my entire life. I write about coins, I sit on the board of coin organizations, and I realized that if I make a substantive and substantial shift in my life, I can go from being the oldest guy at the hardcore show to the youngest guy at the coin show. That's a good deal. Like, I like
I
that
love it.
because I don't want to be 70 at a punk rock show. I would much rather be 70 at a coin show. So I've been super focused on coins and writing about coins, studying, researching coins in the last few years as my, other thing that I'm doing with my life other than presenting and writing books and whatnot. So it's been a fun shift.
That's a pivot if I've ever heard of one.
Yeah,
I will say.
it's a big pivot. It's been great.
But I love that.
And what's interesting about that, as an aside, is that one of the things when you referenced, loving hardcore punk rock music, that comes up often is the community, the sense of the friendships that happen. Well, I spent so much time engrossed in that world that I forgot that there's other communities that are quite awesome,
Yeah.
right? So when I made a choice and said, okay, I want to change my friend group and just see what happens. I just want to do an experiment
Right.
and just see
Add
what
to it.
happens. And yeah, and now the people I talk to all day, every day are coin people, and no one's talking about stage diving or moshing. Oh, what a change.
Right. Or having their back broken from stage diving, being in mosh retirement. No,
Yeah.
I love to hear that, and I think the community of hardcore is something that's particularly someone who's been working in like relationship science for the past 10 years. The community aspect has always been most interesting again, and I always
Oh
say
yeah.
for better or for worse, just because I think it's like such a unique. It's a unique context to exist within, just in general. And I think that, you meet some lifelong friends, and of course, you meet folks who you're like, I hope I don't see them at the show tonight. But that adds to the character, that adds to your skill set of like, all right, like that's life in general. You're going to always go anywhere and have folks that you're going to want to engage with or not. But I'm particularly interested because you were actually part of something in the Seattle scene that I think you're a co-author of an all ages dance ordinance law, and I have to say that's a pretty niche accomplishment that I'm obsessed with. And I'm curious on genuinely like, can you take us to that time in your life on like what in your brain did you always know like I'm going to author a law one day, or who are the people in your life who are like, okay, we need to get together and do this, and why was it needed?
Great. So let me give some background to listeners on what we're talking about here. So in Seattle, at the time the Nirvana album came out, when the world was focused on Seattle as the music mecca and grunge became into the fore of people's minds, there was a law on the books already for years called the Teen Dance Ordinance. The Teen Dance Ordinance in Seattle effectively prevented all ages music from happening. So for those who know music, having music be accessible to people of all ages is a plus. Kids can make bands, people of all ages can go to shows together, and access to music is not restricted by age to be able to drink alcohol. So let's say you're under 21, you can still go see a band. You can form a band and play a show. This is critically important to the artistic expression and social development of any city. So with that in mind, a draconian law had been put on the books in Seattle called the Teen Dance Ordinance, which effectively ended all ages access to music. The idea was that the city was protecting youth from the ills of music, which if we go back in time to the 1980s, fell right in line with lyrical restrictions and a lot of moralizing which came up at the time.
Was that the
But what it
satanic
did in the
panic
city,
moment?
what did you say?
Was that the satanic panic moment?
Satanic Panic, certainly, Parents Music Resource Coalition, all those sorts of things, Tipper Gore. So with that in mind, we wanted kids safe too. No one wants kids to be unsafe.
Right.
But kids being unsafe and access to music are completely separate. Like just because kids have access to create bands and write songs and go to shows does not mean they're going to become immoral or live on the streets or become drug addicts. And there was a false equivalency being created on the part of the city in this regard. So this law made it so youth in the city had to go elsewhere to form bands, to see shows, because just because there's a law doesn't mean that the kids are going to adhere to that law.
Right.
So what was happening in the city was that people were going elsewhere. They were getting in dangerous situations, and that was true not just for punk rock, but for hip hop and other aspects as well. Now, the long story long of this is in a podcast called Let the Kids Dance by KUOW and NPR by a guy named Jonathan Zwickel. It just came out this year. It's brilliant, and it accounts the entire history of Seattle music as it relates to the Teen Dance Ordinance. Not the entire history of Seattle music, as it relates to the Teen Dance Ordinance. So not to have people shut off this podcast, but as soon as you're done listening to this one, go find the 7 episodes of Let the Kids Dance. It's brilliant.
I'm curious, though, for you at that time, like, as just what, I'm not sure what age you were around that time, but, like, is that something where you felt, like, empowered, or did you have other people in your life who were like, hey, we should do something about this? Do you want to join in, or were you kind of leading
what
that
happened,
effort?
basically, I'd moved from Connecticut where there was this iconic club that we mentioned, and people went there. And whether you were 17 or 27 or 24 or 16, you went to this venue, and it was safe, insofar as if you're going to stage dive, that's an unsafe activity, right? But realistically, walking in the door is not going to turn you into a homeless, houseless person or a drug addict. It's just not the case. The point is, when I moved to Seattle, here I was in the mecca of music, as people were calling it. And it's 1991. The Nirvana album came out 3 weeks after I moved here.
Wow.
The city explodes. The tourism went through the roof, and all ages music was illegal. So something had to be done. So to make a long story short now, a group of us decided to do something, and there was coalitions that were formed, and a woman named Kate Becker and myself decided to petition the city council, trying to change the system from within. A task force was created that was designed to hear the issues of people in the music community. We joined that task force, and after a year of that task force meeting with members of the fire department, the city council, the mayor's office, the legal department, the police department, and all sorts of different factions from within the music community, what I found, and my friend Dave Whitson found, was that what we were arguing about every single month with that committee was the difference between a dance and a concert. Because the law was the teen dance ordinance, but we weren't talking about rights of students to go to dances or to dance. This wasn't Footloose. We wanted access to concerts. Well, what happens right now, in this exact moment, if you and I were in the same room and a band started playing, would we be at a dance or a concert? We might say a concert. What happens if you and I start going like this, and we're dancing? Now, are we at a dance or are we at a concert? Well, maybe we're at a dance. What happens if the band stops playing, but we keep going like this? Is it a dance or is it a concert? Okay, you see what I'm getting at.
Yes.
Take that, add clubs, add venues, add live music, and we were a year into arguing what's a dance and what's a concert. So my friend Dave and I were like, that's it, we've had enough. And we basically got together and took all of the available teen dance ordinances, which had sprung up around the country from moralistic municipalities who had decided to protect their youth, and we redlined all those documents. So if a document from, say, the city of Memphis or whatever it was said, this is an ordinance to protect youth and prevent anything bad from happening with all ages music, we would redline the parts of that sentence that we didn't like, so that the sentence said, this is an ordinance to allow music. See what I'm getting at?
Yes.
And we compiled them all into a document. We submitted it to the city, and again, long story very short, the city put it through the chain of command, as it were, and passed it. So the law that exists in the city of Seattle now, that changed the face of not just music but politics in the city of Seattle, is the all ages dance ordinance that I co-authored with my friend Dave.
Amazing. I love that story. And again, I think I'm always impressed when I don't know, a group of people can come together to, I don't know. I think it's like it shouldn't be as fascinating as it is, but even just two people coming together to accomplish something, like, it just makes me happy. And I'm curious, like, from those friends in that era, like, did you find yourself taking lessons from that moment in life that have, like, helped you navigate other spaces, or have you felt like that was like a chapter that was closed, where it was like, that was my, like, activism period where I was, like, in the city council, and that chapter's closed? Or have you
Every
kind of
day,
taken lifelong
inspiration
lessons?
every day. The
Yeah?
teen dance ordinance struggle and the work, like, for access to youth and against the all ages dance ordinance, meaning like the city vetoing it, other people being opposed to it, changed all of our lives. It changed the face of the city. The next mayoral election was determined in favor of a mayor that supported all ages music rather than in favor of the one who opposed it. So we literally changed the face of the history and politics of the city of Seattle through the work that we did. It wasn't even activism. It was just determined work on the part of citizens. I mean, if they made parking on the city street cost $500 an hour, I would hope that we would all do something about it, right? So when people had access to music and that was legal, we're good. But what we learned from that was people can make a change, and that you can make a change working within the system. Because oftentimes what we hear is that you have to work outside the system and go against the system. Well, la-di-da, that's not a thing. I mean, it is, but it's also a thing
Right.
to work within the system and make substantive change, because we did that in Seattle, and that's undeniable. And again,
Within a short time frame too, like
it,
surprisingly
it
for
was a
government.
handful of years. There was a lot of years. It was probably, I mean, my gosh, it was probably a decade or so, but still, that's
Oh,
not
that
the
is a lot of
longest
years.
amount of time in the history of the world. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
it really, it was a lot of work, but we got it done. And again, there's venues in the city of Seattle, which are at Seattle Center, literally the center of Seattle where the Space Needle is, that are city run now. So
Right.
that means 20 years ago, the city was opposed to all ages music. Now, the city not only is for it, but supports it and pays for it. That's interesting. Yeah, we changed that. And it's not just Dave and me. Kate
Yeah.
Becker, Sheila Capstani, a whole crew of people worked together on this in shifts and different forms for years. Check out the Let the Kids Dance podcast
Yes.
from NPR. That's a monstrous, awesome, fantastic account of this entire history, and it's fascinating.
I love that. Okay, my last warm up question, and this is a specific who question, but I'm curious, who inspired you to start or join a band?
Working with the band.
Yeah, just who planted that seed for you of like I could be in a band. I could
Wow.
do this.
I would say it was the members of, and this is ironic because their new incarnation of their band was supposed to play Seattle tonight, and they canceled, a band called Pegboy. But there was a band called Naked Ray Gun and a band called Husker Du, and I'll tell a story about each of them that was instrumental for me doing a band. The Naked Ray Gun story is they had a song, and I'll make it short because people wouldn't know the song. They had a song about heartbreak, and they were playing the song at the Anthrax when I was maybe 15 or 16 years old. And I think I was already playing, playing music, but I didn't realize how viable it was to play music and how important it was to contribute artistically to one's community and in terms of self-expression until two moments, one with Husker Du, one with Naked Ray Gun. The Naked Ray Gun moment, they're on stage playing the story about heartbreak. The song is going on. There's a break in the song at one point after a lyrical statement about heartbreak or something like that. I can't remember the exact lyrics. And then the song immediately continues. The song, break, song, you know what I mean? And in that
Yeah.
break, my friend and I are standing up right next to the stage, and Jeff Pizzati, singer of Naked Ray Gun, is singing this line, and it gets to the break, and my friend screamed out something that wasn't in the song. He screamed out, "And I'm still hurting," in the midst of that little break, and then the song continued. And Pizzati looked down at him and went, "Yeah," like off the mic. And I get goosebumps thinking about it right now, because this was not, you're watching major band, major concert, major venue in an arena. This is a one-on-one interaction that just happened with us and the musician. I went, whoa, this is way different. Your music can really impact people and have a visceral, immediate connection with the listener. And the other one was this iconic punk band named Husker Du. Were playing the Agora Ballroom in West Hartford, now defunct. A venue, if you look up the musical history of the Agora Ballroom and the bands that played there in the 80s, it's mind-boggling. Everybody played there. But Husker Du was playing. My friend and I were walking around the venue. We saw two of the members of Husker Du at a drinking fountain, and my friend said to them, "Welcome to Connecticut," as they were leaning over the drinking fountain about to drink. And they kind of were like, "Yeah, okay." And as they started to drink, as one of them started to drink, my friend said, "Welcome to Connecticut. Just don't drink the water." And they turned around like, "What?" And then realized my friend was kidding and started laughing. And I shared a laugh with them. And I went, wow. So in this genre, you can actually talk to the musicians. That hadn't worked with Motley Crue. That hadn't worked with Pink Floyd. They never laughed at my jokes when they were half a mile away on a stage in a
Right.
concert arena. I couldn't say, "Don't drink the water." Like, they're not going to hear me. But here, it was immediate. So I thought, okay, I want to establish immediate connection with people. And of course, I'd been doing that from the stage with speaking, but I thought with music that could be pretty cool too. So that's where the seed was planted, through
I
those
love
those
that.
those guys and in Naked Ray Gun and Husker Du.
Something that always is interesting to me is that, you always hear we are a product of our environments, right? Like, why are so many people quick to say that they don't have a mentor despite us all being products of our
Well, I
environment?
mean, mentors are all around us. I mean, I write about it in the book. There's a chapter called "Develop Relationships That Matter." outsmart the dread of isolation. And the reason I wrote it is because we feel isolated in a society where we're often behind screens and where our interaction is limited to in-person interaction is limited. We often feel isolated. Now, that isn't to sound puritanical and that I'm against social media at all, because this interaction is just as valid as an actual in-person interaction. But when we disassociate ourselves from other people and are behind screens without interaction and just, scrolling, we miss a critical component, which ties right into mentorship, which is the fact that we become more of ourselves as we are in relationship. I'm more of myself in this moment than I was 2 minutes ago because of listening to, talking with, and speaking to you. We become more of ourselves as we see ourselves reflected in the responses to other people, to the things we say and do, and how we interact. So we are developing as we are in relationships. So mentors are all around us, even if we don't realize it. The interaction that we have throughout our day, each day, say with the person at the gym who checks us into the gym, makes us more of ourselves on some small level, but it's still there. So there are mentors all around us, just maybe not in a formal setting. And I think that, a formal setting of mentorship is really positive and really powerful.
Right. I love that answer, and I think that's my concept of the mentorship mindset is all about that, where it's like everybody has a lesson to teach and a lesson to learn from one another. And
I think it's great.
It's I think until you stop to like realize like, oh, there's opportunity here, it seems like it's so interesting how we like prevent ourselves from experiencing those connections, even though they're right at our fingertips, either like literally on our phones or in an Uber. I always call it my Uber mentorship, where I'm like, ooh, if I'm getting in an Uber, you bet I'm going to have a conversation with my Uber driver to hear. And I always learn something new or some new perspective that I think is fascinating. But I'm the weird one for that, I think. A lot of people are like, please don't talk to me. Oh, I don't want to talk to my Uber driver. And it breaks my heart a little bit because I'm like, wait a second. Like, I think I'm just fascinated by that concept again of like why we're so quick to not want to connect with like the world around us. I'm like, what does that say about us as
Yeah,
humans?
no, it's hard too. I mean, interacting with people is challenging, especially for some people who are more introverted. It's not easy to get on a call, say with you, and have you ask me questions and I answer, or I ask you something and you answer. This is challenging. It's much easier if I
Fair.
shut my laptop off and go play
Take a nap.
Fortnite. That's easier,
Yeah.
right? But I think we learn a lot about ourselves when we engage with other people, and again, through relationship, we come into being.
Do you think that like that's kind of like part of the key of I guess those who are more open to those connections or not is that interest in learning?
So it's not. I don't think it's that people aren't interested in learning. I think it's that they're apprehensive because of social conditioning to make themselves vulnerable and let people know that they don't know, or they're vulnerable just to open up and connect and share. Right? I mean,
Right.
I take it for granted that I could walk into any room and walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, I'm Greg. How are you?" Right? Or I could
Right.
ask you, "How are you?" It feels like we've known each other for 3 years. We've known each other for 30 minutes. So it's easy to not let yourself go into that space because it's intimidating. It's a little hard. It's a little challenging to say to somebody, "Hi, how are you?" and be vulnerable. So it's not a question of not wanting to learn. It's just a question of feeling slightly overwhelmed by the conditions that we've set up for ourselves in society.
Do you find yourself, especially knowing the work that you do you have any like kind of tips or tricks or like things that you do to help people connect with you? Since like I think me and you are very similar in that I think we could probably go up to just about anybody and say, "Hey, how's it going?" and start a conversation. Do you have like little tricks in your toolkit to help the other person engage with you by chance, or
Absolutely. I think that number one thing for me, is to tone it down. When I meet somebody, is tone it down. I don't have to go in like a golden retriever and just be like, "Hi, I'm Greg. I'm so excited to meet you. Tell me every single thing about your entire." Tone it down. The second is to be empathic, right? And
yeah,
assume not that everybody is ready to have a conversation right off the bat, but that people might want to just warm up a little bit, and you got to read the room. I think it's important to read the room. I talk about
yeah,
that in the book too, about listening and how critical it is to listen in moments and just read nuance in people. And if you can't read nuance in people, that's the task. The task isn't whether or not to connect. We all need to connect. We're social creatures. But the key is to seek the nuance in other people and be listening to it so that you can meet them on their terms. I don't need to drag people into the Greg Bennick experience. I would rather meet them halfway. I think that's way more interesting.
Right. That is where it gets interesting. Now, I'm curious on the other end. So, in the introduction of your book, you mentioned how the world constantly influences us with ideas, like making it hard to tell which thoughts are truly ours and which are planted by others. I'm curious, how do you discern which people or influences to pay attention to in order to stay kind of true to your own path?
Wow. So which people are the ones to pay attention to?
I'm curious how you got to that because I know it's a journey.
Yeah, it's a journey, and I would say it's in part guesswork, right? You're not
Yeah.
sure. You're never quite sure. You know what I mean?
Right.
20 minutes from now, you and I, it might reach a point where we can't stand each other. I don't think that's going to happen, but I
Plot
mean,
twist.
you never know, right? So I think
Right.
that it's guesswork. I mean, my gut feel is that you're nice. You seem reasonably sane. The conversation is enjoyable, right? So let's continue. And I
Right.
think that that's a good way to approach conversations with people is to, chapter 1 of the book is called Believe in the Possibility of Kindness. And it's rooted in the idea that if we believe in the potential of other people, and if we approach them with kindness rather than from the side eye, like, what are you going to do to me or against me, we run the risk of having potentially nurturing, excellent conversations, interactions, and a developed relationship. So I think that when we enter into a conversation from that space, it benefits us to keep an open mind, to believe in the possibility of kindness, and also just to do a little guesswork and to say, you know what, I'm thinking this person might be interesting. I might be able to help them. They might be able to help me. We might learn from one another. And if after 5 minutes, 5 hours or 5 years, you realize otherwise, there's other people you can talk to, right? There's billions actually, and you can go seek them out and have conversations with those folks and see how it goes.
Right. You can choose who your mentors are. That's the thing that I tell everyone
it.
is you can choose who they are, and you don't even have to meet them. You can read about them. You can watch them. They're truly everywhere if you choose to believe it. But
I agree.
I'm curious now to get into some of your mentors who have made you who you are. I know at least one, just having started to read your book. I loved the story behind it, and I'll leave that to you to share a little bit about. But you named John Wilson as a mentor who you call when you need a little perspective in your life. I'm curious, how did you meet him, and when did you realize he was a mentor?
Ooh, I like talking about John Wilson.
John
So John
Wilson.
Wilson is probably 25 minutes away from me right now. I haven't seen him in about a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And I have a feeling, because John's got this just energy about him, I don't know how to describe it, that as I'm talking about him, John's kind of perking up somewhere, like he's going to know.
He's like, do I need to send him a message soon?
Yeah, well, also, and the universe works that way, right? I'm not one to believe in universal interweavings of energy. It's not really my thing, but it is kind of strange, right? If you and I start talking about Larry, and all of a sudden Larry texts you, it's like, wait,
Right.
how did that work? I don't have
Right.
an explanation for it. But John Wilson, who I love talking about, one of the greatest influences in my life, he's the greatest genius you've never heard of. John was my professor of theater history and performance theory at Cornish College of the Arts in Seattle, and was instrumental in helping me understand the relationship between ritual and theater and how that plays out in society, the way that we present to others, the way we are presented to, and how that affects who we are. John was deeply influenced by a man named Otto Rank, and Otto Rank wrote a book called Art and Artist, which is about aesthetics. I would recommend it, but you'd get 10 pages in and you'd think, wow, I hate Greg Bennick. It's very hard to read. It was described by one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life, a guy named Sheldon Solomon, who was the former chair of the psych department at Skidmore College in New York. Sheldon described Otto Rank, Art and Artist, as circular nonsense. And it's true. However, Rank's writing style is quite extraordinary, that he will say something that makes no sense, and then 30 pages later make a reference to it, and you go, oh, now it makes sense. And then 70 pages later reference, you see what I'm getting at? It is
Yes.
circular, nonsensical, but it does make sense. John was really influenced by Rank. Rank was writing about aesthetics and writing about the nature of art. What is it about something that attracts us to it artistically? And he was integrating that into his kind of social theory, for lack of a better word. And I know this is all very esoteric stuff, but John was deeply influential because he was very curious about how does theater play out in day-to-day life. You know, in ritual, you had people doing things that they thought were connected to spiritual or ethereal realms. In theater, you've got some of those things maybe even acted out the same way, but in presentational mode so that people could watch them happen. Well, that's a different interaction. A ritual you're involved in, a theater experience you're watching and experiencing, but there's a feeling that happens in both of those things. John's next question was, okay, where do those feelings come up in society? How do they come up in society and allow us to learn more about ourselves and about one another and about things we want and things we want to shift and change? So John was like a radical, revolutionary, conventional thinker rooted in theater and art, and every single thing he says blows my mind.
I'm curious, when you first
John.
met him, I'm like, when you first met John though, was he the type of professor where you like went to one lecture and you're like, I need to talk to this person one-on-one. I'm going to go up to him and be his best friend.
Oh, yeah. I mean, John's lectures, at Cornish College of the Arts, when I was there, John's classes were 6 or 7 students. So when I heard about John, everyone knew John. Everyone talked about him. The 6 or 7 students a semester who took John's classes were always blown away and transformed. So I actually had to petition the school to take John's classes because he was in a different department. I wasn't even supposed to take his classes. I petitioned to take his classes, and through fighting it out or arguing or requesting gently it out, the school allowed me to take his classes. But yeah, it changed. You know, he changed my life. He changed my life. And he was a combination of a theorist. He still is a combination of a theorist and very practical. So he would do dramaturgical analysis for plays, which meant that he was the one who would come in and tell the director, okay, you're doing Romeo and Juliet, you're setting it in 1940. Here's what we know about Romeo and Juliet, here's what we know about the 40s that will inform your production and make it more visceral for the audience. That's what the dramaturg does. But John was also an academic. I mean, I remember he handed us our final exam, a midterm exam, which was very challenging at one point. We had, days to work on it. And then it came time to the final exam in John's class. And I remember he handed it out. And right before he handed it to each of us, and it turned out it was just one question. And we could use any resource in the world to answer that one question. And we had, I think, a week to answer it. My answer to his one question was a 60-page play. I wrote a 60-page original play. That was my answer to his question. As he handed out this piece of paper with this one question, he looked at the class of 6 of us and he said, the midterm was like getting run over by a truck. And we all went, yeah, man, was it ever. He said, the final exam is like the truck backs up and runs over you again and again and again. And he just handed out this impossibly hard question to us that we all had to answer. He was an academic and a scholar and a researcher and a thinker, and yeah, I wish everyone could know more about John, and I'm glad we're talking about him here.
Now, how did he react to your 60-page play?
He said, as I walked in the next week and handed it to him, I won't swear on your podcast, but what I will say is, John took it and he held it in his hand. He looked up at me, he looked down, and he said, you wrote an effing play?
And you're like, yeah, yes.
I said, yes, I did. I had to, it was what the question demanded. The question made a demand of, it made an academic demand of each of us, and I answered the demand. I answered the request of the question. So yeah, it took 60 pages and to take the form of a theatrical production to do that. I'm telling you, John Wilson is so cool. He's great.
I believe it, and like he probably thinks the second you turned into the play, he probably thought you're the coolest student ever, and like makes sense as to why you're still connected to this day. Because as someone who's worked in education, like you just have those students that like, as an educator, you're doing your best. You're putting you give challenges, you see how folks respond, and then you just have that one student that just like always takes it like 110%, and you're just like, how? Like, this is great.
No,
But
and to the credit of my fellow students, we were, it was a magical time at Cornish. We were there in a golden era, and there was a lot of good stuff happening. But John was a catalyst, which speaks to mentorship and the idea that your influence on somebody can be profound, and his most certainly was. It was profound. I mean, keep in mind, this is decades ago, right? This is in the
great.
90s that this happened, and I'm still talking about him with such enthusiasm that when we hang up, I'm going to call him and just be like, I love you. You're amazing. You changed my life. 30 years later, he was just my professor. He's just some guy. You know, this is
Right.
not like, he's not my mom. He's not my dad. He's not, you know what I'm saying? He's literally a guy I took 4 semesters total of classes from, and then I was his teaching assistant for, for a bit. This is, actually, wait a minute. No, I took 2 semesters of classes from John, and then was his teaching assistant for 2 more semesters. 4 semesters of my life, and here we
Boom.
are 30 years later, and I'm like, I love this guy. Everybody, John Wilson. Yeah.
John Wilson. And how has your relationship with John evolved over the years?
Awesome question. It has been amazing because what we did is after I graduated, we became friends. We would go on walks and talk. And if one of us was going through a breakup or a divorce or a connection or a triumph, we would talk about it. And not just talk about it, like, so what do you have going on? Well, I went through this amazing experience recently. Let me tell you about it. Let's talk about what it means. And we would have these conversations about what it signified and, whatever it might be, whatever tragedy or triumph it was, we would talk about what it signified and what it means, and we just go deep on meaning, and it was very cool. And he introduced me to Otto Rank, as I mentioned, and Ernest Becker, who is the cultural anthropologist I'm writing the biography of, and definitely just changed my thinking and the trajectory of my life.
I love it. And here you are again, like writing your a second book now that's based on that influence.
That's exactly right.
And
Yeah.
he's noted right in the first book as well. Now I'm curious, like another person has put you on to Cornish College of the Arts. That's correct. Tell me a little bit about how you learned, how you got to Seattle, how you got to Cornish College of
Sure,
the Arts.
absolutely. So I went to Syracuse University for a year and dropped out. No offense to Syracuse. I met some really great people there. One of my best friends I met there at school, a professor there at Syracuse, and I still are in touch. But I was there for a year, and I dropped out. At the time, Syracuse was a heavy party school, and I quit drinking when I was 17. So by the time I went to college, I wasn't interested. Heavy party school at the time, and I just wasn't interested anymore.
Yeah.
Even though the punk scene in Syracuse then exploded and became a whole shenanigans. That's another story for another time. I dropped out. And the reason I dropped out is because I met a man named Larry Hunt. Larry Hunt was a mask maker, a theatrical mask maker and theatrical performer. And he used masks as metaphor, where he would play all these different characters wearing a mask and then change the mask and be a different character, all as metaphor for how we interact in society. What masks do we wear? What do they signify? So I saw him perform, and I said, would you ever consider having somebody train with or study with you? And he was like, sure. And I said, great. Dropped out of school, went back to Connecticut, where he was from, and spent a year going over to his house and having this informal mentorship relationship with him where I would just study mask making and learn about mask making from him, and I would make masks and we'd talk about them. He'd make a mask, we'd talk about them, and I learned how to to do all this work with masks and whatnot. And Larry was another of these geniuses that people haven't heard of. I mentioned John Wilson, who's John's an actual genius. Larry was very likely genius-like. I can't speak to him being an actual. I'm not sure John's a genius. But Larry was an incredible theater performer. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And he performed throughout Connecticut. He performed around the United States with masks. And at the end of this year's apprenticeship, he suggested to me, what are you going to, he asked me, what are you going to do next year? I said, well, I'm not sure. He said, well, there's this school in Seattle. A friend of mine works there. You might go out and audition, see how you do. And I did. I came out to Cornish in Seattle and auditioned and got in and moved here. But it was all because of the influence of Larry, who, I speak of him affectionately. He passed away a couple years ago, and he was another person who just never quite got his due. He just never, he was an incredible performer. His company was called Masque, Masque, and he had worked with a company called Imago for a while, who were an established theater company, and Larry just never became famous. He was just this brilliant guy doing incredible theatrical work and was deeply influential on me. So, in fact, my senior project at Cornish was split into 4 parts. I had to do 4 different senior projects, and one of them was deeply influenced by Larry, deeply influenced. So yeah, his work was very profound for me.
I'm curious, when you decided to drop out of college to pursue mask making with Larry, what was your parents' reaction to that?
Okay, great question. So my dad is this kind of radically minded corporate guy. And what I mean is, my dad is he's always thinking around corners. He's always thinking different angles. He's not middle of the road in his thinking, but he always worked corporate. And the reason is because his generation did that. You either worked as a laborer or you got a corporate job if you were able to, and my dad was able to, so he did. So he was always working for these corporations, but always thinking different angles and different approaches, and that was really influential. So I think when I came to them and I said, I'm going to do something different, my dad was like, all right, let's see how that goes, because that was kind of his way of thinking, was not to just be middle of the road and do what you're supposed to do all the time. My mom changed her career every 10 years. So my mom was an aerobics instructor. Then she was a hypnotherapist. Then she worked in and ran a learning center for kids with developmental disabilities. And every 10 years she changed her career. So when I said I'm changing paths, my parents were like, all right, let's see what happens. They were
right on.
They were probably, a little worried at first, but at the same time supportive. So, I mean, put it this way, and I ended up in Seattle, right, 3,000 miles away from them. They didn't prevent me from going, so
right.
That was pretty fun.
And you ended up spending, like, the rest is history. You never left Seattle, did you?
I never did. I never
Wow.
left Seattle.
This is a question I think I'm always interested to hear how people answer. So if you could actually go back and mentor your younger self, what advice would you give?
Oh, great question. Without a doubt, I would say start doing things. Fear nothing. Go, 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 go. Fear nothing. We waste so much life in fear. We waste so much life in fear and inaction. What's somebody going to say about me? What are they going to say to me? What are they going to do? I would tell my younger self to go and do and get underway. Thankfully, I did a lot of going and doing and getting underway. I'm very happy about that. But I would say do more. What happens? What happens if you do the things that you fear the most? And granted, right, forming a band, playing in a band, touring around the world was a pretty cool thing to do and pretty fun. What other things would have been available to me had I not been afraid? Who knows? I always thought, wow, it'd be fun to be in movies. It'd be fun to be an Olympic pole vaulter. Who knows? Try the thing, do the thing. That would be my mentor advice was, write down a list of 5 things you want to do, and then come back to me in 6 months and tell me that you tried all 5, and we'll come up with 5 more, unless you're on a path with one of them, that sort of thing.
And that's a good mentor, someone who's going to hold you accountable to the thing that you're wanting to do and explore, because I think that's the hardest part is like, yes, you can have someone say, oh, go do the thing, but then the person who's curious about you and actually is like, hey, how did that thing actually end up? That's the best part of mentorship, is that like, hey, I was starting to think of that reality for you too. I was invested in that just as much as you. I think that's the motivation that I think fuels so much of people's careers, is like when people start getting curious about you and the things you want to do, which I'm so curious, as you were in your early career, you started off as a professional juggler. That is, I think, the coolest like out of college job possible. And what influences or folks did you have in your early career who were like supporting you then, and like how were they uniquely supporting you? Like thinking about, all right, do you want to juggle forever? Like, did you have people who were kind of like planting seeds to help you kind of develop and think about what all you've accomplished now?
Well, I did my first professional juggling show when I was 13, so it was early on, and like I said, I was doing events for special events and higher level events pretty early on as well. And my parents were instrumental in this. They thought, you know what, give it a shot, see what happens. They always wanted me to have something to fall back on, which
Yeah.
I was resistant to. I just figured, go for it, do the thing, right? Back to what
Yeah.
we were talking about a couple minutes ago. But my parents were influential. They were very supportive. But, there was people along the way, John Wilson as well. When I was in my early 20s, I remember John Wilson at one point saying to me, Greg, why is it that people watch you juggle? And I said, well, it's because it's really cool, and I'm really cool. I'm the coolest guy because I can juggle.
Yes.
He said, no, that's not it. Come back to me tomorrow and tell me why people watch you juggle. And I was like, okay. So I came back the next day, and I was like, John, I've got it. I know why people watch me juggle. They watch me juggle because they can't, and they wish they could, and they think it's really neat. And he said, no, it's not it. I'll give you another day. Come back to me tomorrow and tell me why people watch you juggle. I was like, what? So I came back the next day, and I was like, John, I don't know. I don't know why people watch me juggle. They just do. He's like, it's not good enough. He's like, I'll tell you why people watch you juggle. People watch you juggle because you play with elemental forces that affect us all, that root us to the earth, that affect the tides, the way the planets move, the way that this planet interacts with the universe, and you are playing with it. They are watching you juggle because they are in awe of you playing with an elemental force that affects us all.
There's that
Okay.
genius coming out.
That's John Wilson. So, and that's a mentor too, right? That's
Right.
somebody who gave me the opportunity twice to find the answer and then guided me through it. And then the conversations were about playing with that elemental force. When you throw a ball in the air, you're not just catching a ball. You're throwing a ball in the air, and it's a metaphor for something. And that changed me. It changed everything.
Wow.
I mean, it changed everything. So that's why, to this day, when people are like, "Oh, juggler, hey, you're a juggler," it's like, sure, I'm a manipulator of metaphor.
There you
Is
go.
more of what I am. I play with life lessons in the form of gravity. That's more interesting to me and more accurate.
I play with life lessons in the form of gravity. Wow, there it is. That's the elevator pitch.
I love it.
Right
I love
there.
it.
Have you ever met someone who's challenged your perspective in a way that kind of changed you fundamentally in how you move about the world,
So it's just somebody who's changed my perspectives.
or challenged your perspectives? So, kind of like been like, no, that's not it. This is how.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, I mean, of course, I'd say John Wilson. I mean, that's a given, right? I'd say that, certainly him. There's been so many, because I've encountered so many people along the way who have said something, and I've thought, oh wow, I didn't see things from that perspective. But I would say there was a man, and this is kind of indirect in a way, but it'll make sense. There was a guy named Neil Elgie. Neil Elgie passed away a few years ago as well. He was elderly, a former doctor in Seattle. He was the founder of a group called the Ernest Becker Foundation, and they studied the work of this cultural anthropologist I'm so interested in. And Neil introduced, I mean, I knew about Becker. John Wilson introduced me to Becker, but Neil invited me into a social circle where academics were discussing Becker's work. This was at a time where I was very interested in what Becker was writing about, had no one really to talk to about it other than John. And while John was certainly enough, being invited into a social circle where academics were talking about these ideas was really interesting to me, because I'm not a traditional academic. I'm kind of this quasi pseudo academic kind of guy. So I don't have advanced degrees. I've just read all the books and can hold my own in a conversation. But I was invited by Neil Elgie into a speaking opportunity in front of a room full of academics early on, and he really changed my thinking from I don't belong in this world, meaning these are academics, I'm not that, to the term academic is a barrier to entry that I can step over and have conversations with people. And Neil Elgie invited that.
I love that.
I was on tour. I'd been writing lyrics to my band's record, our album, and it had included references to Ernest Becker's work, and heard about this Ernest Becker Foundation, and heard that they had a conference coming up. And I wrote, I think, a letter to them, maybe. It might have been an email. I can't remember at what point in human history this was. But I said, my name's Greg Bennick. I'm in this band. I'm writing lyrics inspired by Ernest Becker. I'm going to be at your conference, and I'm looking forward to it very much. And that was it. I don't think I even heard back. So I show up at the conference, and I'm there with my then girlfriend, Cynthia. Cynthia's sitting next to me. And we're sitting in the back row, and I'm dressed like a punk rock guy. I mean, I don't mean like a mohawk. I mean, like, I had a t-shirt on, and maybe, I don't think I even had a button-down shirt. I think I had like a hoodie on or something and some shorts, whatever. And Neil Elgie is standing in the front of the room. At the time, he was in his late 80s, I think, and maybe in his 80s. And he had just let another speaker finish. That speaker, who had delivered a very academic presentation, walked off stage. Neil comes on. He says, "Thank you very much, Jeff. That was very interesting. Thank you for your perspectives on Becker and how he relates to," and blah, blah, blah. And then he looks out at the audience. He says, "Is Greg Bennick here?" And I went, "What?" And Cynthia next to me hits me on the shoulder. "He said your name." I'm like, "Is Greg Bennick here?" And Cynthia's like, "Raise your hand." So I raise my hand, and Neil says, "Greg, come up and tell us about the work you're doing with your band." And he walks off the stage. And I walk up in front of this audience like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And I walk up and I turn around and I look at the audience, and it's a room full of people who are like, staring at me. And I said, "Hi, my name is Greg Bennick. I sing in this local band, and I've been writing these lyrics inspired by Becker's work. I'd like to read you one of the songs, and I'll read you the lyrics, and if you're interested, I'll send you a CD of, that was available at the time, I'll send you a CD of the band." And I read the lyrics to a song called Reflections, and when I got done reading these lyrics, I expected to be thrown out the window, right? I mean,
Right.
What good does a room full of PhDs have to do with the guy who's like, "Yeah, I'm singing about these, ideas that you've spent your life studying." And instead, as I walked back to my seat, from here, 40 feet to my seat, I was given 14 or 16, I can't remember exactly, I think 14 business cards from
Right.
people at different universities around the country who are like, I'd love to hear your music. And that became
Right.
my community for the next 20 years. The next, probably 20, 15 years.
Shout out to that mentor, because that's just, I think, so important. It's so important to teach people and show people they belong in spaces, and that's such a
That's it.
beautiful way to because what he knew is that you were doing something that was so niche, and so what he felt was like his little niche thing that no one was really probably interested other than this group of people that he'd put together, and you to be going out and making art about it like probably blew his entire mind, where it's like, wait, you're taking this to a whole other level that none of us here have done, whereas your perspective, you're coming in like, I'm just a kid who's writing songs for a band.
I'm writing songs. So what's interesting though is, okay, so let's take it to into the listener's hands for a second. You don't know, listener, we don't know, us, what our influence is going to be on somebody else if we're just doing our proverbial thing. Whatever that might be, it might be really deeply influential for somebody else. And here I was, just some guy writing lyrics for my band, but in Neil Elgie's eyes, Neil is thinking to himself, here's something completely different. This guy's writing lyrics? Like, this is unbelievable. So, and people in the audience were like, wow, this is really novel and interesting. This guy's writing lyrics. This is kind of unbelievable.
Right.
So it was really interesting. We don't know how far our influence is going to be, and we might not feel significant or important, but we might very well be to somebody else. And that's, the essence of mentorship right there,
Yep.
I'd say.
That's what I always tell people is mentorship is the long game, and a lot of times you're never going to know just how much your words influenced or impacted that individual, but a lot of times, typically 5-10 years down the road, I'll see a lot of like students particularly who will circle back around and they'll be like, you mentioned this one time, and this is actually the route that it completely took me. And so that was part of my job, is making sure like mentors know, like, you're not going to get that immediate validation, but trust me, if you like put in your time and you like put in the care, like you'll get that long-term impact, whether you through it seeing them do the things that they wanted to achieve, or if they come to it and realize it and eventually you're like, wait, you're the person that actually put that thought in my head in the first place.
That's right.
Which is my
That's right.
favorite. I would love, so I was going to ask the question for my last question here. What is a book, a podcast, or an idea from someone that left a lasting impression on you? However, I would love to know, personally, from your book, like, what is the lasting impression that you're hoping to make on readers of your book now that it's out into the world. You can answer, of course, your personal question too, but I just have to give you any and all the moments to talk about this book because it's got me excited.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm happy to. So just for people who are unfamiliar, the book is called Reclaim the Moment, 7 Strategies to Build a Better Now. And the idea is that we are often thrown off track by a world which is convoluted and complex. And we can create space for our minds to have room to grow and to have potential to do things and create things in the world only if we focus and only if we strip away the convolutions, if that's a word, that surround us all the time. So there's chapters in the book on focus. There's chapters in the book on creative exploration of our ideas and why it's important. There's chapters in the book about reverberating the ideas of others and being a sounding board for others in a really encouraging way. I think that the lasting idea from the book that I'd like people to take away is that there is space to be stepped into, even though it feels like we have no space in our lives and in the world. There's space to be stepped into. What will we do with the space that we create when we focus, when we develop relationships, when we allow for our creativity to come out, not necessarily even in the form of a painting, but in the form of something that we're trying to get accomplished, whether that's at work or at play, whatever it might be. When we create space, what will we do with the space that we create? That's interesting to me. And the lasting thing that I'd like from the book is for people to write me and say, hey, I read your book, and as a result, my mentor did, my mentee did. You see what I'm saying? That's
Yes.
what I'd like is, what do we do with the space we create? That's really ultimately the question.
See, and I know you're not a formal academic, but I swear, if you don't get in a classroom at least once, like I would love to see that happen. I'm like, when's your moment to teach a class?
I'd love that. I would love to. One of these days I should pursue a master's degree or a PhD and sit around like this and then
Right.
tell fun stories.
That's the retirement gig. You got lots of time.
I like that. I like that.
That's what I always say. Like, I'll get another degree back when I'm retired, and that'll be my moment.
I like
Well, it's been a joy chatting and learning a little bit more about the mentors who've made you who you are today, Greg. And I'm curious, before we go, any final words or questions that you have for the listeners?
Yeah, I would say drop me a line anytime. You can be in touch, whether that's on LinkedIn or on Instagram. I'm at Greg Bennick, GregBennick. Find me, ask me questions, talk about ideas in the book, talk to me about other ideas. I would just love to hear from people, and I love to connect. And if people want to know more about the Teen Dance Ordinance, I'll point you in the right direction. Or if you want to know more about Ernest Becker's work, there's a handful of us in the world who are constantly with brains filled with Becker and his ideas. Happy to talk about him and any of the things we talked about in the podcast. Happy to discuss anytime.
Yes, and send me all the links so we can put them in the links section below, and everyone
Great.
can have easy access to you and your work. And that's all I have for you today. Any final questions
you.
for me?
No, you're great. Thank you for championing the idea of mentorship and the idea that we can be a positive influence and an encouraging influence on other people. That's top notch.
That's right. We all have something to teach and something to learn from one another. So that's all for today. Thank you so much, and take care.
Thank you.